The site of the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the state of California. All of these massive stories that were going around. I'm Paul Cavey. I run East Asia Econ, an economic analysis firm. This is my main companion when I'm trying to work. The parrot, he's called Tusa. Toast in English, because he likes to eat toast. He sometimes lets me work, but he doesn't actually like me working. So usually he's on the keyboard or on the mouse if I'm trying to do anything, and bites my hands if I try to work. So in having this conversation, we'll see how we get on. I'm based in Taiwan. I think that gives me quite a unique perspective on what's going on. I've lived in mainland China, in Beijing, in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, and are now based in Taipei. I've had 25 years or so looking at macroeconomics in the region. I was originally focused on looking on China, and that when I was living in Beijing, that was really preoccupied all of my time. But since then, working on the buy side, I've been looking at a much broader range of economies, and so including Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, and often look at what's happening in Hong Kong as well. And I think it's a really interesting time for thinking about these economies at the moment. And the reason for that is we've got a few things coming together. And the framework I'm trying to use, I think the idea is really like it's kind of like Back to the Future. You remember that film released in 1985? And it was quite an interesting time economically as well, because that was when Plaza Agreement originally happened. And the Plaza Agreement is one of the big ways that we can frame what's happening in East Asia today. And if you remember back then, the Plaza Agreement was between the big countries, the big economies of the world at the time. What was the big complaint? The big complaint was that the US dollar was too strong. The US was running a trade deficit with particularly Germany and Japan. And so the Plaza Agreement was all about trying to get the US dollar to be weaker and these other currencies to be stronger. Now, Taiwan, as a small economy, and obviously an economy that isn't really recognized as a country by most other countries of the world, wasn't party to that Plaza Agreement. But it was very much part of the same forces. And in fact, if we look at what's happening in the world today, the most similar thing to 1985 is actually Taiwan's trade surplus with the US. Back in 1985, that was running at over 10% of Taiwan's GDP. Now, obviously, what happened in Taiwan over the course of the subsequent 30 years or so was a lot of manufacturing moved to China. And so you had Taiwan's trade relationships moving from directly associated with the US, moving back towards much more focused on China. In that process, Taiwan's trade surplus with the US shrank. And now what's happening today? Well, there's been all of this pressure over the course of the last few years for Taiwan and other countries to move their manufacturing away from mainland China. Taiwan has very much followed that. There's been a big rise in the proportion of Taiwan's trade that's going back to the US. And as a result, we have this big similarity with back in 1985, which is that Taiwan's trade surplus with the US is once again more than 10% of GDP. So why do these things matter? Well, one of the things that was happening after 1985 and why we bring up Taiwan in this conversation is because obviously the big focus was Japan. Japan was the second largest economy in the world. It had this big trade surplus with the US, and the US wanted to get rid of that. And so it manufactured this appreciation of the yen during the course of the 1980s. And that's very famous, right? Because the yen moved from like over 200 against the dollar to around 100 or thereabouts. As a result, the trade surplus came down. There was this massive bubble in Taiwan, in the Japanese economy, with the Nikkei going through the roof, and all of this talk that the site of the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the state of California. All of these massive stories that were going around, and this massive economic development that happened in Japan and then stopped. And so as a result of that, then there was this 20 years of economic malaise in Japan, which really is still, Japan's only emerging from today. Now, why bring up Taiwan in that conversation? Because although it wasn't party to the same agreement, the forces were the same, right? The US was complaining that Taiwan had this big trade surplus, so the Taiwan dollar also was forced to have this appreciation. There was actually a bigger equity bubble in Taiwan during the 1980s than there was in Japan. As an example, China Life, right, the big financial company, the big insurance company in Taiwan, was trading at around 90 times book. I mean, it's like amazing, right? Off the charts sort of things. But this obviously doesn't get discussed often because Taiwan's not included in a lot of these conversations as a small economy, and that isn't included in a lot of international comparisons because it's not a country. So all of these things happen, right? But Taiwan, I think, was very relevant to this conversation. Now, what happened thereafter, and again, one of the other parallels and why we should be thinking about Plaza today is because as this process played out, these appreciations of the currencies in both Taiwan and Japan in the 1980s, what was a result of that? Well, obviously, there was a big change in competitiveness. Like all of the manufacturing that was previous in these economies found it very difficult to survive when the exchange rate was very different to the exchange rate that applied before. As a result, this wasn't that there was this manufacturing to begin with. There was an improvement in the US trade balance for a while. Is this going to be a problem with the parrot screeching like this? Is he going to get heard, or we're going to have to do something about that? So to begin with, as this process played out and these currencies appreciated, there was an improvement in the US trade balance. And the flip side of that was the manufacturing in Taiwan and Japan began to slow down. Now that was short term, particularly in Taiwan. Because what we saw happening from both Taiwan and Japan was as the currencies appreciated, as the manufacturing competitiveness began to change, what was their reaction? One of their big reactions to this was to move manufacturing from Taiwan and Japan into mainland China. So you end up with this big irony, I think, which obviously isn't talked about today, that the big focus of a lot of this stuff coming out of the US towards, thinking that once again, the US dollar is too strong, the US trade deficit is too big, it's all the fault of these East Asian economies because of what's happening with their currencies being too cheap. One of the reasons we're back in this situation is precisely because of the exchange rate appreciations caused by Plaza One, which allowed these economies to move manufacturing to China, which led to the rise of China's manufacturing sector. And China is now obviously the big counterpart to the US imbalance. So you have this big irony in the way that, often these things are talked about. And in the way that when we go back and look at the policies that are being thought about in Washington, D.C. once again, to try to resolve this latest bound of global imbalances, what's one of the key things that's being discussed? The fact that the US dollar is too strong and these currencies in Asia need to appreciate. That's exactly what happened with the conversation in 1985. And it was a conversation and a policy prescription that worked for some time, but clearly didn't work forever because we're back in the same situation today. So all of that is kind of like this movement of manufacturing and the things that happened in the 1980s is very relevant for how we should be thinking about what's happening in Asia today. And that's again why I think this parallel with Back to the Future being released in 1985 is so relevant for how we should be thinking about China, the region as a whole at the moment. Now, if we go back and look at other things of aspects of this, what's happened over the course of the last few years and the impact of that today. So we look at these bubbles in the 1980s. Again, it's very relevant to think about both Taiwan and Japan. The bubbles both burst at the end of the 1980s, right? Like this kind of equity valuation, like the property values in Tokyo, these things couldn't continue. And as these economies warmed up and both the central banks in both Taiwan and Japan raised interest rates during the 1980s, eventually the bubbles burst. Equity market prices came down. Now, the interesting thing is, like a lot of the discussion today, when we look at China and mainland China's economy at the moment, there's a lot of people who are looking at the comparison with Japan back in the 1980s. And they're saying, well, look, particularly over the course of the last few weeks, the collapse in longer-term bond yields in China is beginning to look very similar to the fall in Japanese yields that happened during the 1990s and 2000s. And so there's a lot of people now thinking that this is like Japan. China is going down the same route that Japan went down. And that route was manufacturing that moved into mainland China, but also a collapse of domestic activity in terms of what was happening with banking and real estate and all the stuff that was very bubbly during the course of the 1980s. One of the things that's missed in this, though, is when people look at Japan, they often don't realize that actually it was also the manufacturing sector that hit a wall, right? So it wasn't just this domestic stuff that came to a sudden stop. It was also because manufacturing hit a wall, partly because of this massive appreciation of the yen that happened during the 1980s. And so if you look at the big companies of Japan, the electronics companies of the 1980s like Sony and Hitachi and so on, look at what happened to their earnings. They continued to grow until about 1995 or thereabouts, but then they just stopped growing. And so it wasn't just real estate and banks that had problems. It was kind of the leading lights of Japan's manufacturing sector also hit a wall at the same time. Now, if you look at Taiwan and Taiwan's experience after the 1980s, it was very different. So Taiwan had a lot of the same problems domestically. The banking sector was in a mess after the 1980s. The equity market came down and so on. And if you look at the banking sector, right, like it took sort of, again, 20 years or so for the government in Taiwan to really recognize that there was problems in the banking sector. And even then, the sort of structural stuff, the reforms that were carried out really weren't as sort of, they could have been much more aggressive than they actually were in the end. So it took a long time to get over those issues. However, the big thing that was different about Taiwan was the manufacturing sector didn't hit the wall in the same way. So there was this massive outflow of manufacturing towards the mainland, which happened probably more quickly in Taiwan than it did in Japan. And partly a result, a lot of the traditional Taiwanese companies managed to remain competitive because of that. But at the same time, it was really in the 1990s that Taiwan's electronics sector and the tech sector began to come of age. And so all these companies that are so famous today, like TSMC or Delta, or the manufacturing companies of notebook computers and so on, like it was really in the 1990s that they were cutting their teeth and really starting to grow very strongly. So you had this very different economic experience in Taiwan after the bubble burst in the 1980s from the experience in Japan after that bubble burst in the 1980s. In Japan, it was really like everything hit a wall. The car companies were doing well, but a lot of the other stuff really just stopped growing. Whereas in Taiwan, you certainly have problems in real estate and in banking sector and in some of those sort of sectors. But when we look at manufacturing, actually it continues to do quite well. And that was one of the big differences between these two economies. And why is that relevant for today? Because when we look at China and what's happening with China's economy, there's clearly lots of problems with the domestic economy. If you look at what's happening with real estate, I mean, it's quite remarkable, really. When we look at like property sector in China today, if you spoke to most economists before, say, 2020, and you told them that property activity, property starts, property construction, property sales, all of these things were going to go down by 50% or more in absolute terms over the course of the next 5 years, most people would have said, like, that's impossible to happen. If that happens, China's economy is going to collapse. And actually what we've seen since then is precisely those kind of falls in property activities, like really quite remarkable from where we were before. And yet it doesn't seem that the economy is really in recession, or at least in depression. Lots of the economy is weak, but there's some sectors which are still quite strong. And that really is the parallel that's much more relevant to Taiwan back in the 1990s than Japan in the 1990s. And so what are the sectors that are doing well in China today? It is the manufacturing sector. It is the export sector. Things like autos, these new industries which are emerging in China, which weren't there before. And like that should sound very different. That should sound very similar to the experience of Taiwan like 20 or 30 years ago. And so, what is the other thing that's kind of relevant in this? That there has been an appreciation of China's currency, steadily really over the course of the last 20 years or so. Like there was an appreciation that happened. It didn't happen at the same pace as happened in Japan and Taiwan back in the 1980s. But there was an appreciation. But the difference, particularly again with Japan compared with Taiwan, is that the currency in China hasn't been appreciating over the course of the last 5 years, at least in real terms. And it's in real terms, which is what matters for economies and for competitiveness. So thinking about an economy and a currency in real terms is trying to differentiate between the inflation, what's happening with inflation in different economies, right? So if China has a lower rate of inflation than it does in the US, and everything else remains unchanged, then over the course of time, Chinese companies are going to become more competitive than companies in the US because their cost is coming down relative to costs in the US. And so it's very important to think about currencies in real terms. So let's go back and look at what happened with currencies in the 1990s. So Japan's currency appreciated very quickly before 1989. After 1989, the bubble burst. What happened thereafter? The currency continued to appreciate. It went up about another 50% during the course of the 1990s. What happened with Taiwan? Taiwan's currency stopped appreciating after 1989. And in fact, after that, there was 20 or 30 years of steady currency depreciation, both in nominal terms, but also in real terms. So over the course of the next 20 to 30 years, Taiwan's current economy became increasingly competitiveness based on what was happening with the currency. So again, you have this very different experience, right? You think about these differences we've got economies which in the 1980s look quite similar. Japan and Taiwan both having these big bubbles. And then you have economies after the 1980s which start to look very different, with Japan having an economic malaise that lasts 30 years or so, and you have Taiwan where the economy started to grow once again after the 1990s. What was one of the big differences between this? It was what was happening with manufacturing and exports. What was one of the components of that difference? It was the exchange rates between the two, where exchange rate in Japan continued to appreciate, the exchange rate in Taiwan depreciated. So now let's go back and look at China today. You got the similarities in terms of the 1980s with the bursting of the property bubble and the collapse in activity that's happened in China as a result. But one of the things that's very much underappreciated in a lot of the debate about China today is the fact that actually the currency has been depreciating. It's not clear in nominal terms, but when we adjust for inflation, China's currency today is cheaper than any time since 2014. So what is one of the reasons that the manufacturing sector is doing well? I mean, there's obviously all of this industrial policy. There's been sectors in China that exist today that didn't exist before 2020, and the electronic car sector is obviously the biggie in those. But the other thing that's driving this is this exchange rate difference. That China's exchange rate is actually quite cheap, and certainly not having the same level of appreciation that happened to the yen during the 1990s. And that's one of the things that's helping China's manufacturing sector today. So that's another difference between, when we look at the experience of the Japan in the 1990s and this very common discussion around China today that China is following in that path, there's two extremely big differences. One, what's happening with the manufacturing sector and the export sector. In Japan, it stopped growing. In China, that clearly hasn't been happening. And the second thing is one of the reasons for that is the currency, where the currency in Japan continued to get less competitive during the 1990s, where China's currency today is getting more competitive than ever. Now, that then again is also relevant for when we think about what happens with Trump. So the other kind of thing, the big theme of the region, and one of the things, to be thinking about a Plaza Agreement is because obviously there is this new administration coming in the US. The incoming Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has talked specifically about these global imbalances and specifically the role of Japan, China, and South Korea, all the economies that, I cover in a lot of the research that I do. He hasn't mentioned Taiwan specifically, but the fact that Taiwan has this massive trade surplus with the US means that it is going to be something that's very much caught in the crosshairs. So the incoming US administration in terms of economic policy is clearly very much focused when it thinks, East Asia is very much in the crosshairs of everything that's going to happen in the US if there is some attempt to try to look at global imbalances. And so what is the US talking about? First of all, then the difference between, Plaza One and where we are today is Trump is much more willing to use tariffs than anything that happened in the 1980s. In the 1980s, one of the reasons the Plaza Agreement happened was because there was this threat of protectionism. There was some specific stuff towards Japan, but nothing like the tariffs that Trump used in his first round of administration 8 years ago, and certainly nothing like the massive tariffs and global tariffs that the second Trump administration has been talking about. There was the threat of protectionism, but it didn't happen. This time, tariffs look like they're going to be much more material. Now, what happened with tariffs the first time around when they were introduced in the first term of Trump's presidency? One of the implications of that was depreciation of the CNY. That as tariffs went up, the currency in China sold off. And partly as a result of that, as we went through 2020 and the COVID disaster, China's current exports remain very strong. And so it wasn't the death knell to the export sector, partly because the currency took some of the pressure. So where we are today, one of the policies that the Trump administration is clearly talking about is imposing more tariffs. What's the market been doing in China over the course of the first couple of weeks of January? It started to trade in and depreciation of the currency once again, partly because of this threat of even bigger tariffs coming down the road. So the first time around, tariffs resulted in a cheaper currency. If you're an investor, the easiest trade at the moment is to think, well, tariffs are coming again. The Chinese currency has to get weaker. But again, you need to think about where we are with what's happened over the course of the last few years. The currency in China today is not strong. In real terms, it's the cheapest it's been since 2014. The market is now once again trading at a cheaper currency over the course of the next 18 months or so. And actually, if there's two things really to think about the currency in China. One is interest rate differentials. So because of all this, domestic angst that the property sector is very weak and China's economy is deflation. As a result of these things, interest rates in China are falling very quickly. And obviously, when you think about currencies in nominal terms and bilateral currencies between different economies, one of the big drivers of that is interest rate differentials. Now, China so far has actually been trying to beat against that wind. So if you look at interest rate differentials alone, ignoring everything else and tariffs and all of this other stuff, actually China's currency should already be arguably 7.7 or 7.8 against the US dollar. Now, the fact is the currency is only 7.2 or 7.3. So it seems very obvious that the PBC has been leaning against the wind and stopping that depreciation from playing out. But that's even not assuming that tariffs are coming down the line. So if tariffs coming too, presumably it's very easy to see dollar CNY rising above 8 over the course of the next 12 months or so, right? That would be probably the way the market should be thinking about this. But what's the implication of that? The implication of that, I mean, obviously, tariffs are going to be very negative. We need to talk about them in more detail. But in principle, tariffs are very negative for the economy. But one of the things about this is the currency is already very cheap. Why are China's exports gaining market share in volume terms around the world? It's partly because the currency is quite cheap. And if this kind of, market expectation comes true over the course of the next few months, the currency is going to be even cheaper than it is today. So it's very unclear right now that, the US administration, so you've got these two ironies, I think, playing out at the moment. That one, the US government saying that one of the reasons why you end up with these global imbalances is because currencies are too cheap. One of the reasons why China is having this big imbalance is because there was currency appreciations in the 1980s that led to all this manufacturing moving to China. The global imbalance that the US had with the rest of the world didn't change. All it did was a reshuffling of the balance between some of the other Asian economies and China. So currency appreciation of some of Asia didn't work when manufacturing can move to other economies. The second thing playing out today, which looks like a big irony to me, is that the market once again pricing in a cheaper CNY. But if the currency is going cheaper, that's not going to be something that dents Chinese competitiveness. Now, obviously, the first point about that in all of this protectionism and the fact that back in the 1980s, manufacturing moved from Taiwan and Japan to mainland China, that prevented the US imbalance changing very much. Now, what's been happening over the course of the last few years since US tariffs were imposed during the first Trump administration, there's been a lot of manufacturing, seemingly, or at least the flow of manufacturing from China has changed. It's not going directly to the US anymore. It's going via other countries and ending up in the US at the end of the day. So what's the implication of that? It's going to be very difficult for tariffs in China, for tariffs in a second round of Trump tariffs. It's going to be very difficult, again, to affect the US imbalance with the whole world unless there's global tariffs which prevent the manufacturing from China moving to another economy and then being exported into the US. Now, that is something that can happen, right? Trump has said he's going to impose pretty much tariffs on everybody. So maybe that is where we end up going to. But the implication from the US economy of that is very different from having some, isolated tariffs on one admittedly very big trading partner. But if there's tariffs imposed on the whole world, that's going to force up US import prices and be bad for inflation in the US. So there's sort of like a lot of things involved in where we are with the global economy at the moment, which actually makes it, some of the things that the market is pricing, where things are going to go, it ends up defeating the policy objectives that some of the people coming in the US administration want to achieve. So I'm Paul Cavey. I run East Asia Econ. We do a lot of this research about what's happening in all of the economies across Asia, the interactions of those with the rest of the world. If you like the video, please subscribe. And if you're a financial investor and interested in learning a lot more about these economies, look at the research on our website and get in touch with me to subscribe to our full service.